The transmission echoed across Earth's screens, filling every household, every government building, every corner of the globe with the voice of the alien general. His tone was sharp and commanding, laced with contempt. "Humans," he began, his towering form displayed against the backdrop of his warship, "you are weak, cowardly, insignificant. Your species clings to a fragile existence, incapable of true combat. I, General Verkos of the Turgle Empire, challenge you. Send your greatest warrior to face me in a duel. If they win, I will spare your pitiful planet. If not, your annihilation will serve as a lesson to all who defy us." The broadcast cut off, leaving silence in its wake. In the United Earth Council chambers, tension crackled like a live wire. Diplomats, generals, and scientists crowded the room, their faces drawn with worry. "It's a trap," one scientist argued, his voice trembling. "The Turgle Empire doesn't negotiate. They're baiting us into despair." "We have no choice," replied General Malik, the head of Earth's defense forces. "If we refuse, they'll destroy us outright. If we fight, at least we have a chance." "Chance?" scoffed a diplomat. "Against that monster? Their warriors are genetically enhanced, bred for war. Even our best soldiers don't stand a chance." A voice cut through the din, calm and steady. "I'll go." Heads turned toward the speaker. John Kane stepped forward, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. His gray hair and lined face spoke of years lived, battles fought, and lessons learned. Though he no longer wore the uniform of Earth's military, his presence demanded attention. "You're retired," Malik said, his tone a mixture of surprise and doubt. "Doesn't mean I forgot how to fight," Kane replied. "I've been through wars worse than this. You don't need someone young and fast. You need someone who knows how to think." "You're suggesting we send an old man to fight a genetically enhanced warlord?" the diplomat asked incredulously. Kane's lips twitched into a faint smile. "An old man who's won wars with less." Despite the skepticism, the council knew there were few options. Humanity had no heroes left, no secret weapons, no miracle technology. They had John Kane. The preparations were minimal. Kane refused high-tech equipment, saying, "I need tools I trust, not gadgets I've never seen before." He took a combat suit for basic protection, an old sniper rifle that had seen countless battles, a knife, and a few basic supplies. As the final checks were made, Malik approached him. "You're sure about this?" Kane nodded. "They think this is about strength. It's not. It's about outthinking your enemy. The bigger they are, the easier they are to outmaneuver." The room was tense as the broadcast resumed. General Verkos appeared again, sneering. "This is your champion," he said, his laughter echoing. "A frail old man? Humanity truly has no hope." Kane, already on the transport pod that would take him to the battlefield, leaned back and closed his eyes. His voice was low but resolute as he muttered, "We'll see about that." The pod hurtled through space, carrying Kane toward the barren moon chosen as the arena. The journey was brief, giving him little time to dwell on the enormity of the task ahead. He wasn't afraid of dying. He'd made peace with that long ago. What mattered was making this count. As the moon's surface came into view, Kane's thoughts shifted to strategy. He'd studied the Turgle Empire's combat techniques during his years in the military. They were powerful but predictable, relying on brute force and overwhelming firepower. Verkos would expect a straightforward fight. Kane had no intention of giving him one. The pod landed with a hiss, and Kane stepped out onto the desolate landscape. The air was thin, the ground cracked and barren. Across the field, Verkos emerged, a towering figure clad in gleaming black armor that seemed to absorb the weak sunlight. He carried an energy weapon that looked more like a cannon than a rifle, its edges humming with lethal potential. Verkos grinned, his sharp teeth glinting. "I'll make this quick, human. Try not to embarrass yourself too much." Kane said nothing, raising his rifle and steadying his breath. His hands were steady, his gaze unwavering. This wasn't about proving himself to Verkos or anyone else. This was about survival for him, for Earth, for humanity. As the duel began, the weight of billions of lives pressed on Kane's shoulders. But he didn't falter. He'd been here before in 100 different ways, on 100 different battlefields. And he knew one truth above all else. The best weapon wasn't strength or firepower. It was the mind behind them. The ground trembled slightly beneath Kane's boots as he surveyed the battlefield. The moon's surface was harsh and unforgiving, a maze of jagged rocks and deep crevices. The thin atmosphere carried a faint hum. Energy traps, likely set in anticipation of the duel. Kane exhaled slowly, letting his instincts take over. This wasn't a fight, it was a hunt, and he was the predator. Verkos wasted no time, charging forward with his massive energy weapon raised. Each step he took left a deep impression in the cracked soil, his armored frame exuding raw power. With a thunderous roar, he fired. The energy blast erupted in a blinding flash, disintegrating the terrain where Kane had been standing moments before. Kane had already moved. He sprinted sideways, his smaller, lighter frame allowing him to navigate the uneven terrain with precision. He ducked behind a rock formation, listening to the crackle of energy tearing through the air. His mind worked quickly, mapping the field, noting possible choke points and high ground. "You can't hide forever, human," Verkos bellowed, his voice amplified by his armor speakers. "Come out and face me."
Kane didn't respond.
Instead, he steadied his breath and peeked out, catching sight of the general's position. The alien's armor gleamed, but Kane noticed a faint shimmer around it, some kind of energy shield. He'd need to disable that first. Verkos fired again, obliterating the rock Kane had been using for cover. Kane rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast. Dust and debris filled the air, but he used it to his advantage, moving silently toward higher ground. The general stomped forward, his frustration mounting. "You think you can run from me? You're nothing but a coward." Kane smirked to himself. Let him talk. Let him waste energy. He reached a vantage point overlooking the general's path and set his rifle down, adjusting the scope. He had no intention of fighting Verkos head-on. This was about precision. His first shot rang out, a high-caliber round striking the shimmering shield around Verkos. The energy rippled, distorting momentarily. The general snarled and turned toward the direction of the shot, firing wildly. Kane had already moved, disappearing into the maze of rocks below. "Is that all you've got?" Verkos taunted, his voice echoing. "A single bullet won't save you." Kane didn't answer. He adjusted his position and fired again, this time aiming for the shield's emitter on the general's shoulder. The round hit its mark, and sparks erupted from the device. The shield flickered, then went dark. Verkos growled, his anger palpable. "You think you're clever, old man? Let's see how clever you are up close." The general charged, closing the distance with alarming speed. Kane barely had time to leap from his perch before Verkos's massive weapon smashed into the rocks, sending shards flying. Kane hit the ground hard but rolled to his feet, his knife drawn. The general swung his weapon again, but Kane ducked, slipping under the massive arc. He slashed at a joint in the armor, sparks flying as the blade scraped against the plating. Verkos roared, backhanding Kane with enough force to send him sprawling. Pain shot through Kane's ribs as he hit the ground, but he pushed himself up, refusing to stay down. Verkos loomed over him, raising his weapon for the finishing blow. Kane reached into his pouch, pulling out a small explosive device he'd scavenged earlier. With a practice throw, he lodged the device into a vent on the general's weapon. The explosion was small but precise, disabling the weapon and forcing Verkos to drop it. The general stared at the smoldering remains in disbelief, his fury boiling over. "You've sealed your fate, human," Verkos roared, lunging at Kane with his bare hands. Kane sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the grasp of the alien's massive claws. He slashed again, targeting another weak point in the armor. Verkos swung wildly, his movements fueled by rage, but lacking precision. "You're too predictable," Kane muttered under his breath, ducking another swing. He led Verkos toward a narrow crevice, maneuvering with purpose. The general followed, his massive frame barely fitting through the space. Kane moved swiftly, placing another improvised trap, a device salvaged from the energy trap scattered across the battlefield. As Verkos stepped into the crevice, the trap activated. Energy surged through the narrow space, stunning the general and forcing him to his knees. Kane didn't waste a second, climbing onto the alien's back and jamming his knife into a critical joint at the base of the neck. The general roared in pain, thrashing wildly. Kane was thrown off but landed on his feet, watching as Verkos struggled to stand. The alien's armor was damaged, his movements slower and less coordinated. "You're strong," Kane said finally, his voice calm. "But strength isn't enough." Verkos glared at him, his breathing heavy.
"You will pay for this."
Kane raised his rifle again, aiming carefully. He didn't fire, though. Instead, he retreated, vanishing once more into the rocky terrain. The hunt wasn't over yet. Verkos steadied himself, his breathing ragged but his fury unrelenting. The energy coursing through his armor had begun to wane, the damage from Kane's traps and attacks mounting. He scanned the rocky battlefield, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You can't run forever," he growled, his voice reverberating. "Face me like the warrior you claim to be." Kane, concealed in the shadows of a jagged outcrop, adjusted his rifle. His movements were deliberate, his focus unbroken. He wasn't running, he was leading. Every step he took, every maneuver, was part of a calculated plan. Let Verkos burn through his energy. Let him grow impatient. This wasn't about brute force, it was about control. The general stomped forward, crushing rocks beneath his boots. His once polished armor was now dented, scratched, and sparking at the seams. He raised his gauntlet hand, releasing a surge of plasma into the air. The blast illuminated the terrain, exposing Kane's position briefly before the old soldier ducked back into cover. "You're a coward, Kane," Verkos shouted, his frustration palpable. "You hide in the shadows, afraid to face me like a true warrior." Kane exhaled slowly, his heart steady. "You talk too much," he muttered under his breath. He shifted his position, circling around the general's path. He knew Verkos would follow the sound of his movements, and he used that to his advantage, leading the alien deeper into the rocky labyrinth. The terrain grew tighter, the pathways narrower. Kane moved with purpose, planting small charges he'd fashioned from salvaged materials. Each device was set strategically, designed not to kill but to disorient and confuse. As Verkos rounded a corner, the first charge detonated. The explosion sent a shower of rocks and dust into the air, momentarily blinding the alien. He roared, swinging wildly at the empty space around him. "Is this your plan?" he bellowed. "Tricks and traps? You disgrace yourself." Kane didn't respond. He moved silently, positioning himself for the next strike. Another charge went off, this time destabilizing the ground beneath Verkos's feet. The general stumbled, his heavy frame struggling to regain balance. Kane took the opportunity to fire a shot, the bullet striking a vulnerable joint in the alien's armor. The impact forced Verkos to one knee, and he snarled in rage. "You think you're clever, human? You think these tactics will save you?" Kane emerged briefly from the shadows, his rifle aimed but not firing. "It's not about saving me," he said calmly. "It's about proving a point." Verkos lunged toward him, his massive arms sweeping through the air. Kane ducked just in time, the force of the blow shattering the rocks behind him. He countered with a quick slash of his knife, targeting another weak point in the alien's armor. Sparks flew as the blade connected, and Verkos howled in pain. "You fight like an insect," Verkos spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Scratching and biting, but accomplishing nothing. Then why are you bleeding?" Kane retorted, already moving to his next position. The general's rage boiled over. He slammed his fists into the ground, sending a shockwave that rippled through the terrain. Kane was thrown off balance, landing hard against a jagged rock. He gritted his teeth, the pain sharp but manageable. He couldn't afford to slow down. Verkos advanced, his movements slower but no less threatening. The damage to his armor was taking its toll, but his determination was undiminished. "You've managed to wound me, human," he admitted, his tone colder now. "But you'll find that desperation is no substitute for victory." Kane steadied himself, his knife in one hand and his rifle in the other. He wasn't desperate, he was methodical. Every move Verkos made, every attack, was a piece of a larger puzzle. Cain wasn't just fighting, he was learning. As Verkos closed the distance, Cain activated another hidden device. This one wasn't an explosive, it was a sonic disruptor, its high-pitched frequency designed to overload the sensors in the alien's helmet. Verkos staggered, clutching at his head as the sound pierced through his defenses. Cain moved swiftly, taking advantage of the opening. He darted behind Verkos, driving his knife into the back of the alien's knee joint. The blade pierced through, and the general collapsed onto one leg, his roar of pain shaking the air. "You're strong," Cain said, his voice steady. "But strength means nothing without control." Verkos twisted, swinging an armored arm toward Cain. The old soldier barely avoided the blow, rolling to safety. He raised his rifle again, this time aiming for the exposed gap in the general's neck armor. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pulled the trigger. The shot hit its mark, and Verkos let out a guttural growl. Blood trickled from the wound, staining the ground beneath him. But the alien still refused to fall. He pushed himself up, his eyes blazing with determination. "You may wound me, human," he said, his voice strained but resolute. "But you will never break me."
Cain didn't respond.
He simply disappeared into the shadows, once more, leaving the wounded general to chase him through the labyrinth. The battle wasn't over yet. Verkos staggered forward, each step heavier than the last. His breathing was labored, the damage to his armor evident in the flickering sparks and exposed joints. The blood seeping from his wounds painted a grim portrait, yet his resolve remained unshaken. He scanned the terrain with narrowed eyes, searching for any sign of his opponent. The silence was maddening, broken only by the faint hum of residual energy in the air. "You think you've gained the upper hand, Cain," Verkos growled, his voice resonating with a mixture of pain and defiance. "But all you've done is prolong the inevitable. Your tricks can't save you forever." Cain, perched silently in the shadows, observed the alien. Every move, every strained breath, told him what he needed to know. Verkos was slowing down, his brute strength giving way to fatigue and frustration. Cain's patience was his greatest weapon now, and he wielded it with precision. The general raised his hand, activating a small device embedded in his gauntlet. A pulse of energy rippled outward, briefly illuminating the battlefield. It wasn't enough to pinpoint Cain's exact location, but it forced him to shift positions, disrupting his cover. Verkos's lips curled into a faint smirk. "There you are," he muttered, advancing toward the disturbance. Cain moved quickly but deliberately, leading Verkos toward the final stretch of the battlefield, a narrow canyon bordered by towering cliffs. The terrain was treacherous, with unstable rock formations and hidden crevices. It was the perfect stage for the endgame Cain had meticulously planned. Verkos entered the canyon, his massive frame barely fitting through the tight spaces. The walls echoed with the sound of his heavy footsteps, each one reverberating like a drumbeat. "This is where it ends, Cain," he bellowed, his voice amplified by the confined space. Cain's voice came from somewhere in the shadows, calm and measured. "You're right. It does end here. But not how you think." Verkos snarled, swinging his arm to fire a pulse of energy into the darkness. The blast illuminated the canyon briefly, revealing nothing but jagged rocks and dust. His frustration grew, and he charged forward, determined to flush Cain out. The ground beneath his feet gave way suddenly, a hidden trap that Cain had prepared in advance. Verkos stumbled, his footing lost as he slid into a shallow pit. He roared in anger, clawing at the edges to pull himself free, but the loose rocks made it difficult. Cain appeared above him, his rifle aimed steadily. "You've underestimated us from the start," he said, his tone unwavering. "You thought strength and intimidation were all it took to win. But humanity's greatest strength has always been our ability to adapt." Verkos glared up at him, his teeth bared. "You think this is victory? Killing me won't save your species. The Turgle Empire will still come for you." Cain didn't lower his weapon. "Maybe. But they'll think twice before calling us cowards again." He fired, the shot hitting a critical point in Verkoz's armor. The energy core powering the suit sparked violently, and the general let out a guttural cry as the system overloaded. The explosion was contained, but it was enough to render Verkoz immobile. His massive frame slumped against the edge of the pit, his eyes burning with defiance even in defeat. Kane descended carefully, standing just out of the alien's reach. "You fought well," Kane said simply. "But you let arrogance blind you." Verkoz's voice was a low growl. "You've won this battle, human. But the war is far from over." Kane nodded. "Maybe. But wars are won one battle at a time." He turned, leaving the general behind as he made his way back to the extraction point. The duel was over, but the message was clear. Humanity was not as weak or cowardly as the Turgle Empire had believed. Kane had proven that strength wasn't about physical power alone. It was about resilience, strategy, and the will to survive. As the transport pod lifted off, Kane looked back at the desolate battlefield. He didn't feel triumph or pride, only the quiet satisfaction of a mission completed. The weight of what came next, what humanity would face in the days ahead, pressed heavily on him. But for now, he had done what needed to be done.